All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's been debated for centuries. What does the Bible actually say about homosexuality?
Hmm.
And how do those teachings, uh, how do they relate to the conversations happening today, about gay marriage? It's a sensitive subject for sure,
Absolutely.
but we're here to give you a clear and balanced view.
Yeah. It's really one of those topics where you have to understand the original text
Right.
and how it's been interpreted over time. That's so important.
Absolutely. So to make sure we're on solid ground, we're going to be looking at uh, two really important translations, the American Standard Version and the King James Version.
Right.
These are some of those widely read and respected Bibles out there,
Exactly. Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with something this complex.
Yeah. Yeah. Because even subtle changes in the wording, they can actually shift the meaning quite a bit.
Hmm.
Now, when it comes to homosexuality, a lot of people point to Leviticus as a clear condemnation. Leviticus 18.22, specifically in the King James Version, states, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman. It is abomination."
Abomination. Wow. I
Yeah,
mean, that's pretty strong language.
it is.
It definitely leaves an impression. But I was actually looking at Leviticus,
Yeah.
like the whole chapter, and it seems like there are a lot of prohibitions listed out in there.
Right.
Like verses 3 to 5 and even 20.22 and a low 2.3.
Yeah.
There's incest, bestiality.
Right.
It's making me wonder if this verse about homosexuality, if it's maybe part of a larger code of conduct,
Yeah.
something specific to the Israelites back then.
It's a good point. Context is really everything at these texts. And what's interesting is that the Hebrew word, the word they use for abomination,
Okay.
tueva,
Okay.
it doesn't always have the same weight that we give it today.
What do you mean?
Well, if you look at other places where tueva appears, like it's also used for things like idolatry
Mm.
or eating certain foods. So things that for the ancient Israelites, they would have considered those things to be ritually impure,
Okay.
but not necessarily like morally evil,
Interesting.
like how we might think of it now.
Okay, so you're saying that in this context, this word abomination
Hmm.
could be less about a universal moral judgment
Yeah.
and more about, I don't know, like ritual purity within that specific culture.
It's a possibility that scholars have raised.
Okay.
And it definitely makes it, it makes you think twice about whether this verse is really a blanket condemnation
Right.
of all same-sex relationships, across history.
Definitely makes you think twice about, applying our modern lens to these ancient texts.
Absolutely.
And, speaking of stories that get brought up a lot, there's the whole Sodom and Gomorrah incident,
Yeah.
the attempted assault on the angels, the fire and brimstone, Lot's family fleeing the city, the whole thing.
It's a powerful story.
It's pretty wild. Yeah. But even with this narrative, there's this debate
Right.
about what the sin of Sodom actually was.
Yeah.
Was it specifically homosexuality,
Hmm.
or was it just like a general wickedness, like a
Yeah.
lack of hospitality or violence or, all of the above?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it?
It is, because I was looking at Ezekiel 16.4950, and it says that Sodom's sin was pride, gluttony, and neglecting the poor.
Hmm.
No mention of homosexual acts there at all.
You see, that's what makes it so interesting. So it's not as clear-cut as some people might think. Maybe we're taking our modern understanding of homosexuality and kind of forcing it onto these ancient texts. It's a debate.
It's a big debate for sure.
That's right.
So we've got some pretty direct statements in Leviticus,
Uh-huh.
some ambiguity with the Sodom and Gomorrah story. But what about the parts of the Bible that just don't mention homosexuality at all?
Right.
Like, it's interesting to me that Jesus, who talked a lot about love, sin, and marriage, he never specifically addresses homosexuality.
That's true. And even Paul, whose letters are, full of lists of sins and vices, he doesn't specifically mention it either.
Hmm.
So this silence, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation
It does.
and theological debate.
It makes you wonder if these texts were supposed to definitively condemn homosexuality, wouldn't they be, a little more upfront about it?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of highlights why there's such a wide range of beliefs and interpretations,
Mhm.
even within Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what makes it such a fascinating discussion. It's not about just finding one right answer,
Right.
but about understanding the complexity
Hmm.
of the text and how people have thought about these questions, for centuries.
It really is like peeling back these layers, of history and
Yeah,
interpretation and all of that.
absolutely.
So we've talked about what seem like prohibitions, the ambiguous stories,
Right.
even the silences. But there's another part of this, right? The Bible is also full of verses about love and compassion.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, the golden rule, Matthew 7:12.
Right.
Therefore, all things whatsoever that men should do to you, do ye even so to them.
Yeah.
For this is the law and the prophets.
Yeah, that's a powerful one.
It is.
And then, of course, you have the that central message of Jesus
Mm-hmm.
to love one another as he loved us.
Right.
John 13:34-35. This idea of radical love and acceptance.
Yeah, it's a big one. So how do we reconcile, how do we bring together those messages of love and inclusion with interpretations that say homosexual relationships are wrong?
Mm.
It feels like a real, sticking point.
It really is the heart of the matter, isn't it? And there's no simple answer. And different denominations, different individuals have approached it in so many ways.
Hmm.
Some hold to a very literal reading,
Okay.
of specific verses,
Mhm.
while others really emphasize that broader message of love. And they try to understand those verses, the ones that seem to be against it, in their historical context.
So it's almost like there's a spectrum of interpretations. Some
Yeah.
people see the Bible as like a rule book,
Right.
with unchanging rules.
Yeah.
And others see it as, I don't know, kind of a living text
Yeah.
where the message needs to be understood,
Yeah.
within how our world is changing and how we're understanding things.
Absolutely. And that's where, I think the debate today, the contemporary debate about gay marriage,
Yeah.
that's where it comes in. How people read those passages, those biblical passages, really shapes how they feel about gay marriage, whether they're for it or against it.
It's so interesting how something written, thousands of years ago still has such a big impact
It really does.
on these really important social issues.
Yeah.
But, if we're saying there are multiple ways to understand these texts, how can we even have like a good conversation about something as
Hmm.
as divisive as gay marriage?
That's a good question. I think it starts with recognizing that the Bible is complex.
Hmm.
It was written in a specific time,
Right.
a specific culture,
Mhm.
and it's been interpreted in so many different ways.
Right.
So maybe instead of trying to win an argument, we should try to understand where the other person is coming from.
I like that.
Yeah,
Like, what's their interpretation based on?
exactly.
Instead of jumping to conclusions, maybe we should be asking questions like, hey, what parts of the Bible are you thinking about?
Right.
Or how do you see those verses fitting in with other parts of the Bible?
Yeah. Be open, listen to their answers, even if we don't agree with them, because we all come to the Bible with our own baggage, our own experiences, and that shapes how we read it.
Absolutely. And it's easy to forget that.
Right.
But if we remember that, then we can be more open to hearing what other people have to say
It's like that saying, seek first to understand.
than to be understood.
That's it.
But even if we go into this with an open mind, it still feels tricky. There's still that tension
Yeah.
between those verses that seem to be against homosexuality
Uh-huh.
and then this bigger message of love and acceptance. So
Yeah.
how do we reconcile those things?
That is the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no single answer that's going to make everybody happy. I think it really comes down to, how each of us sees those different parts of the Bible. What feels most important to us? What feels true to us? What matches our understanding of God's love?
So we've looked at the texts. We've talked about how complex it is. We even touched on, what it means for us today. It feels like we have more questions than answers now.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
This deep dive wasn't about giving you a definitive answer. It was about giving you context, different viewpoints, so you can start to form your own understanding. This is a conversation that people have been having for a long time, and it's one that each of us has to figure out for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a lot to process for sure. I mean, we went from looking at specific verses to like these bigger themes and ideas. It feels like every time we find an answer, 10 more questions pop up.
Well, that's what's so cool about these ancient texts, right?
Yeah.
They make us think.
Mm-hmm.
They keep us searching, questioning. It's not about, having this perfect interpretation that everyone agrees on. It's about wrestling with these ideas, letting them challenge us, letting them, maybe even change us.
So for our listener who's been with us this whole time, who's heard all this stuff about what the Bible says about homosexuality and how it relates to, the debate over gay marriage, what's next? Like, what can they do with all of this information?
Well, first of all, don't just take our word for it.
Yeah.
Go back to the source. Read those passages for yourself. Maybe even try reading different translations. See what you notice. See what questions come up for you. There are so many commentaries and resources out there that can help you go even deeper.
It's like we always say, this deep dive is just the beginning.
That's right.
It's the jumping off point. And as you're exploring all this, remember what we were saying about context.
Right.
Like, think about the history, the culture, the time period these texts came from.
Yeah, and how different people have understood them over time.
Right, exactly.
It's really helpful.
Yeah, and talk to people who see things differently than you do. You never know, you might learn something new.
That's so true. It's easy to get stuck in our own little bubbles.
It is.
But when we listen to different perspectives, it really opens up our understanding. Even if in the end we don't agree.
I think that's key, right? Being open to those different ideas.
Yeah. And something else I think is really important to keep in mind is that these debates, these aren't just, theoretical discussions.
Right.
They have a real impact
Mm.
on LGBTQ plus people,
Right.
their families.
Right. Right. We can't forget that. So as we're, working through all these different interpretations, we have to think about the human side of it all.
Absolutely.
How can we make sure that our understanding of these texts leads to love, to justice, to understanding for everyone?
That's the question, isn't it? That's the challenge. So maybe that's what we leave our listeners with today. How can we as individuals help create a more loving, more inclusive world, even as we're trying to figure out these really tough and sometimes divisive issues?
It's a big question,
Mm-hmm.
but it's an important one.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe as we search for answers, we can find some common ground in our shared humanity.
Yeah.
And in that desire that I think we all have to create a world where everyone feels loved, accepted, and valued.
That's beautiful.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We know it was a lot, but hopefully, it got you curious.
Yeah.
You sparked some new questions. And until next time, keep diving.